Catharine Thompson, who is a professor at the University of Edinburgh and is the leader of the IGO project, which is a very long-running project that's been looking at the relationships that older people have with their environment, how they get out and about in the spaces that they live in. So it's very relevant to the things that we've been talking to today. And I urge you to go and have a look at their website and all the resources that they've got on the website. So over to you now, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? People at the back enjoying a cup of tea? Wave if you can't, please. You'll see that I'm a landscape architect, and therefore, although I hope I can give you some ideas that might extend beyond the physical environment, the examples are ones that come from looking at the physical environment, because that's my area of expertise and that's what I've been interested in. And one of the challenges of the physical environment, the built environment, is that it has to serve everyone. That public environment in particular, or publicly accessible environment, is one that is one size has to fit all. And so the challenge for those of us planning and designing publicly accessible places, public environments, is how we can make those sensitive to individual differences and individual needs, as well as be inclusive and not exclude people unnecessarily by doing so. And I'm going to give you a few examples just of the kind of research, some perhaps more radical than others, that we've been involved with that might give you some ideas. I think what research can offer to practice, and it's a delight to be with this group of participants today who are so expert in so many areas of caring for people and helping support people with dementia, many areas of practice who are far more expert than I. I think what researchers can help with is where we have got evidence that might support interventions, we can share that with you. And as Richard has mentioned, our IGO website is one place. I'll give you the address in a minute, and it's available on the memory-friendly networks network website. We can share evidence of what does work or what can help in the environment. And the other thing we can do, because it's our bread and butter in research, is to help you think about evaluating the effectiveness of interventions you do make. There's been a bit of talk about that already. I know there will be more. But we hope that we can help by teasing out the challenges of, yes, what's ultimately a test of an effective intervention? Well, ultimately, it's the experience of people with dementia and their carers. Ultimately, what that experience is has to be the test. But then, how do we evidence that? In what ways? When you try new things, how do you persuade your funders to mainstream that? Have you got a good baseline against which to compare any change that you've effected? Do you want to look at how much people get out and about in their local community, or do you want to look at stress levels? Different kinds of evidence, different kinds of indicators will be relevant for different contexts and different interventions. And that's the kind of thing, again, that perhaps as researchers we can help you talk through and tease out to give you some good ammunition to support what you want to do and that's appropriate for the community or communities that you're working with. And it also helps you when a funder says, well, do you need to do all of that to have the effect? You know, what if we only gave you half the resources? Could you actually do most of that? What are the things that are really essential? What are the things we could cut back because we're having to cut budgets? Just how much difference have you made to these people? Those are the kind of challenging things that we know in an era where resources are often tight and constrained. You may have to answer these questions, and we can, again, we hope help work with you to give some evidence. We've worked with traditional research methods and with some innovative approaches, and what I'm going to do now is just to give you some examples, I hope just to stimulate you in thinking about what the opportunities are. The kind of things that we've done with conventional questionnaires. There's nothing like actually talking to people and asking them to tell you how they feel and what their experience is, to know how they get on and get out and about. But you can present evidence in a way from that maybe makes a difference to policymakers. So we can look at the difference between, the samples here are people from across different communities across the UK, so it's not one particular community in this case. the difference between people who agree that they have good paths to their local open space and haven't, well, that difference turns out to make a significant difference to whether or not you're likely to achieve healthy levels of walking. So if we're looking at a health outcome that we're all hoping to attain, good paths on the way to our local open space might make a difference or not. Now, this is a sample of people aged 65 and older, not necessarily people with dementia. It's more an example to give you a flavour of the kind of ways that you can present evidence. And we've also looked at how often people get out and about if they're in a sheltered accommodation or a care home, and it's considerably less. And this is just outdoors at all. So there are challenges there in giving everybody opportunities for a good quality of life. But I'm showing this more as the kind of example that you might want to present in a persuasive way. A slightly more innovative bit of work that we've done was working with choice-based conjoint questionnaire, which is a form of stated preference analysis that is supposed to be very helpful in teasing out when people have to weigh up lots of different pluses and minuses, lots of different elements in an environment, what are the things that matter most and just how important they are. We don't all live in an ideal environment, but if you have to, as a local authority, choose between interventions, investing in this or that, how do you weigh up the pluses and minuses? And this is looking particularly at the environment. And we started off by identifying through conventional methods, focus groups, questionnaires, with older participants, and this again was a sample of different communities across the UK, what were the things that older people told us made a difference to them accessing their local park. And we tried to boil it down to a number that were clearly what people told us were important to them. And then within each of those elements, and you saw there were a number of elements there, we look at different levels for each of them. This is to explain how we build up a particular kind of questionnaire. So different distances, whether there are pavements on the way to the park or not, different facilities, different issues to do with nuisance that people identified as problematic. And what we do then, using some very clever software, and I'm not going to bore you with the details of that, but I can tell you more about it afterwards if you're interested, is to then build a questionnaire which offers alternative scenarios. You choose between two scenarios on each occasion. So there's question one at the top, those two, question two. And you can see that what's happening is that some but not all of the things are different between the two scenarios. And the software develops a range of different scenarios so that you look at all the attributes in the course of a questionnaire, but the participant isn't too burdened with having to answer every possible alternative. What it does then is to work out how much weight one kind of attribute has compared with another. So I'm now just going to try and show you what you can get in terms of a model if you have that. This is a slightly twitchy bit of software here, so I hope that you can A, read it, and B, see what I'm trying to do with it, and apologies if it doesn't work perfectly. So what this simulator does is allow us, at the moment, part 1 and part 2 have all the attributes at the same levels. They're identical. And you can see the graph on the right, so there's 50-50. There's no preference between the two, as you would expect. What the software on importances can show us is what are the relative importance of those different attributes to our sample as a whole. And here you can see that the 6 most important: nuisances or absence of them, facilities, quality of trees and plants in the park, traffic on the way to the park, things to watch, levels of maintenance. And we can also, this is looked at for all respondents. We can also, depending on how we've set up our questionnaire, we can look at different characteristics within those respondents. So we can look at people who have difficulty getting around, and if you watch the chart when I pick those, it changes so that facilities becomes the most important feature for people who have difficulty getting around. So for a subgroup in our population, we can see the slightly different importances that we have. But we also have a simulator that tells us, I'm not going to show you all of these different things. So utilities shows us for any particular attribute what the importance between the different levels is. So this is looking at trees and plants, one of the things that I'm interested in. And you can see that the difference between having no trees and plants and even some is huge. So a sort of urban square without any vegetation is very much different in terms of preference to anything with some trees and plants. And then if you have more trees and plants, it makes a little difference, but not a lot. So not all levels have the same difference between them. And you can look at that for distance, for example, and you can see that's a more even difference between those elements. But the really great thing is coming back to the simulator, and this is where it sometimes behaves and sometimes doesn't. Let's get back to sorry, this is where let's look at our all respondents. And it's not behaving. If we can change the levels here, and I'm sorry these have disappeared, this is where it's misbehaving, but I'll show you one I prepared earlier. What I've done here, just so you can see what I've done, is I've changed traffic from being heavy traffic on the left to medium traffic on the right. Everything else stays the same. So part 2 has got medium traffic on the way to it, and that's the only difference. And you can see suddenly 97% of respondents much prefer Park 2 to Park 1. So we know that traffic makes a big difference. What we've done here, and I'm sorry I had to do these prepared earlier because it's being irritatingly geeky and not working properly. Here we've got medium traffic. People like medium traffic. That makes a big difference to their preference. But we've got no trees and plants. And you can see here that Park 1 has become more preferred again. So if you have to weigh up, traffic makes a big difference, but then whether you've got trees or plants makes a difference as well. And it's showing you how these things change as you move between different scenarios. So we could go back to having, no, it's not going to behave. Go back to having some trees and plants, but if we have medium traffic, some trees and plants, let's have a look at what happens if we put many seats into the park rather than few seats into the park. That makes more of a difference to preference. We can look at views, we can look at a whole range of things. Here we've got, let's change the facilities. If we put a cafe in with the toilets, then suddenly Park 1 is preferred compared with Park 2. That's the scenario we've got here. So if we then take out some seats on the way to it, Park 2 becomes more preferred again. So it allows you to do these scenarios where you can change different elements. I'm really just showing you things not because I think we're going to absorb all the detail, but to show how you can, based on the things you put in the first place, and those have to be carefully chosen, both your sample and what you're asking questions about. You need to know those are the important things, but you can then get a whole range of different scenarios, and again, you can look at what difference the preference might have if you've got people who've got difficulty getting around. And here, just at the bottom, you can see for people who don't have any difficulty getting around, they just prefer Park 2 to Park 1. You can see that on the chart as well. If they have some difficulty getting around, they actually prefer Park 1. But if they have great difficulty, they prefer Park 2 more clearly. And that's probably different things coming into play that we could explore. Seats en route for Park 2 versus some kind of facilities in Park 1, those kind of things, making the difference for those different subgroups within the population. So that's choice-based conjoint analysis, and of course, this is based on a UK-wide sample. Talking about dementia-friendly communities, it will be absolutely key if you were wanting to use this kind of technique to have your sample from your local community and to have the attributes of your local community put in and being part of that model. Otherwise, it makes no sense at all. But it does give you a considerable power to just explore scenarios and see different different what-ifs. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint now and give you just a few other examples before very happy to answer some questions. The other kinds of things, we know technology is changing very fast, and we've had some fantastic examples from presenters about using different modern technologies, GPS, whatever, that's terrific. And these are going to keep changing, so we need to watch out for new opportunities, and researchers are always very interested in new opportunities as well. These can help you directly, but they can also help you produce evidence, if certain kinds of evidence is what's needed to get your funders to keep supporting you. And being active, we know being active into old age helps support our health, and in fact a colleague who works in psychology with the Lothian Birth Cohort has recently published research which shows that physical activity is supportive of cognitive health into old age, and actually suggests it's better, it's more supportive to be physically active than it is to do sort of mind games and crosswords and Sudokus or whatever. So staying physically active is good for your brain as well as your body. So accelerometry, one obvious thing that we've done with some participants in another part of the IDGO project, but we've also tied this in with diaries of activity. And again, this wasn't done particularly looking at people with dementia, so apologies that the detail is maybe not relevant, it's more the principle. But this is where we're looking at moderate to vigorous physical activity, what the health scientists are interested in as indicators of sufficient activity. We can see a typical participant here is nowhere near getting 30 minutes of that a day in bouts of at least 10 minutes. But we can see some other useful information if we compare their accelerometry for the day to their diary, and we've asked them to keep an activity diary, and we've asked them to tell us when they go outside the house, which is those red arrows there. And we know that they leave the house at 10 o'clock, they go to the post office, walking and then getting a bus, and go to Guild by bus, come home. They go out again in the evening, just after 6, go dancing. Now what's I love about this is very gentle dancing. You might think that dancing is physical activity. This is obviously, this person's going out there and having a great time, no problem at all. But it's not actually contributing a lot to their physical activity. What's interesting is that if you're interested in physical activity alone, it's getting out of the house at all. And it's the point of going out and coming back is where the physical activity happens. And those are the key elements. And so it underlines that what you suppose might be giving activity, most might not be. But equally, if you don't get out of the house at all, for whatever reason, you're very unlikely to achieve any levels of moderate to vigorous activity. So one example again, and with GPS now much lighter and more wearable, it would be lovely, and researchers are starting to do this, to think about mapping, not just asking people to give a diary, but actually you could map where people go, and they also wear an accelerometer. Some of you may be already doing some research like this, but these are opportunities now that I know a lot of researchers are considering. You get a huge amount of data that's quite challenging to analyse, but it can give very interesting evidence of where people are going and, in terms of activity levels, what they're achieving by doing that. Another very different project we were involved in, and again, apologies that these examples aren't dementia specific, but I think it's helpful to share the kind of things that we are doing and help you maybe think about what's appropriate for your work. This is some work we did for Forestry Commission Scotland and developed a toolkit for them. This is actually aimed at forest rangers and forest managers to help them make their woodlands more inclusive and to help them enhance the use of their local community woodlands. But some of the messages that came out of this and some of the methods we used, again, might be relevant and important for you. I worked with a number of researchers, including a very clever colleague, Cathy Southwell, who based a lot of her research up in and around Stonehaven, but also we did some work in Edinburgh and other parts of the country. And one of the first things she did in looking for problems with wayfinding, this was focused on woodlands, but it could be in any part of your community, is just behaviour observation. Just look at the places where people are confused. Look at the places where people are saying, well, I know this is a woodland, and it said so on the leaflet, but I can't see where to get in on. Is this the same place, whatever? One of the things we discovered looking at the woodlands very close to the Forestry Commission in Edinburgh, don't worry about the detail of this, what it's really summarising is just all the different names that are used for the same place and the different words that are on signs as opposed to on leaflets that tell you about this, so that if you want to go into this woodland, are you going to Castorphin Hill Tower, or are you going to Clemiston Tower, or the Scott Tower, or are they the same thing or somewhere different? These kind of profusion of different labels happen very easily in our society. But actually, if you want a coherent, easy wayfinding system, you need to have the same names consistently for the same things. And just going through and pointing out to people, do you know that your leaflets and your signs are just saying different things, can actually help people responsible for putting those signs in the environment to actually see the problem, because often they don't see it themselves. They're so used to, they know the place, so they don't bother to read the signs. And again, behaviour observation. This was at another site in Scotland, and just looking at people arriving on a coach, a group of older people. First thing often people want to do after a long journey on a coach is go to the toilet. And again, behaviour observation, there's lots of signs there, but not all of them are very clear as to what they are. And Cathy, looking at this, said it was clear that people just wanted to know where on earth the toilet was, so they couldn't work it out. And actually what's interesting in this case is that the sign you can see on the left is there. Part of the confusion is that there are too many signs all in one place, not all of which are clear. The other is that when you look to the left, you couldn't see anything that looked like a toilet block. And you need reinforcement. You need the environment to look like what it's going to do, does what it says on the can. And a lot of our work suggested that that's not always the case. Sorry, that's writing sliding off the top of the slide there. But this is a very different project that we were working on with the Durham coastline, actually. But clear signs that give you direction, that reinforce visually in the landscape what they say, but also give you destinations and distance can be really helpful. But actually, design of the environment can be welcoming or inhibiting just by the design alone, even without the signs. And again, apologies, this is looking just at woodlands, but you can imagine examples in your community. The woodland on the right doesn't look like it's accessible or encouraging you to use it. But that entry on the left, just by the design alone, says, come in, you're welcome. Even if you've got a pushchair or you're in a wheelchair, you're welcome to come in. And it says that without any signage at all. So we can think about the gateway effect, what's inviting, what encourages people to use places, or what deters people just by the way it looks. Forget signage. And obviously, if it's memorable, if it's distinct, then that's really helpful if we're starting to get a bit of cognitive impairment. And so, you can compare the access on the right to the access on the left and think about, there may be good reasons why someone thought that blocking off a route to motorcyclists or something was necessary, but the way they've done it means that the entrance on the right really doesn't feel welcoming at all, whereas the one on the left does sort of invite you. And further than this, obviously taking community members on walks around their community and inviting them to tell us what they feel, what they think, what they like or don't like. Very obvious methods, but we've suggested to our forest managers, well, you could build up a little sort of photo diary or photo map that you've developed by working with communities that describes the environment in their language, in their words. So you're not imposing your suppositions, but getting them to tell you. Now, this example is Donata Woods up in the northeast on a snowy day, so this may not be where everyone would choose to go, but we can get a sense of, are people finding this trail attractive, too difficult, too steep, what they like, what they don't like, and we can use people's own words to describe it. So people say, well, I know where to go. You follow the path, and you follow it round, and then there's a bridge. They give you a sense of what the experience is, what they like or don't like about the changing experience. They can tell you about the bits where you might trip on routes or whatever, so that's a bit difficult. That might not be an accessible route for older people or people with some kind of mobility impairment. But equally, it's really important that we don't limit people's opportunities for positive experience, and these things about seeing the deer, whether there are lots of people around or not that help people feel safe. These are really important elements that we need to capture as well. So we enable people to use the environment as much as possible. We just help design least restrictive environments, environments that don't restrict people where they don't need to, and help them to enjoy what they can. And we've also encouraged our forest managers and site managers to do some role play as well. It's not as good as working with participants, but just looking again at their own leaflets. You've got a leaflet that says, why don't you go for a walk for your health in Stonehaven? So you look at the map of Stonehaven and you think, well, here I am and I want to go to Dunnottar Wood, and how do I get there? And you look at the environment and it's not very clear at all how you get to a Dunnottar Wood from here, even though the leaflet says this is where you should start. So these are the kind of things you can do with participants ideally, but they help you see whether something that you thought was a provision in your local community might actually not be as obvious as you thought it was, particularly for people who are starting to have difficulty finding their way around. Is it obvious that you go over the bridge? Well, you go over the bridge, but then where do you go? Do you go right or straight on? Well, actually, and we are following actually the route to the wood, but it's not at all obvious. You get to here and you think, is this right? I thought I was coming to a major entrance to this public facility that's a woodland. Not at all clear, actually. You have to go up to the right to get to it. Once you get there, actually there's a very nice welcoming sign that tells you, yes, I'm here. Tells you, it does what it says on can. But it's getting to that from the centre of town that may be very difficult and slightly confusing in that sort of suburban landscape. So thinking a bit about where signs might be helpful, where reassurance might be helpful, doing these kind of role-play scenarios or walking with your community members and getting them to tell you what they use as way markers, landmarks to help navigate can be really important. And finally, just to point to some of the sort of geeky end of technology that's starting to come in. We're involved in this project, Mobility Moving Place, at the moment. Myra is working with me on this. And we're very much interested in what is supportive of having a really good experience outdoors, not just what helps you to survive outdoors, to get by if you have to go outdoors, but what makes you feel really good about having gone out and enjoy places. And one of the technologies that we're using is a mobile neuro headset. So this gives us the equivalent of EEG measures, but people can wear it walking out and about in the street. And we've got some plucky older people who are prepared to come out and about with us, and we're looking at the experience of walking into a busy street and then into a quiet green parkland area and then into perhaps a sort of housing neighbourhood, and seeing whether we can actually get data from neurological brain waves that tells us about people's perhaps unconscious or subconscious responses, physiological, to these places, as well as, of course, we ask them to tell us emotionally what their response is. So that's ongoing. We haven't got the answers to that one yet. But finally, just to say that as part of that same project, we are also working with participants in co-design, very much trying to work with people, including people with dementia, to encourage them to share with us what they think is important for them and what they would like to see in design of their environments. Thank you.